Outlaw country singer and songwriter David Allan Coe has died. He was 86 years old. Coe was known for writing so many different big hits. Taking This Job and Shove It also created his singing career after a brief stint in prison.
2 years before he died, David Allan Coe recorded a song called Live Forever. He meant it as a joke, the kind of dark humor he had built an entire career on. Then, on April 29, 2026, he died in an intensive care unit in Daytona Beach, Florida, at 86 years old. His family never revealed the cause of his death, and no official explanation was made public. After surviving a car crash, a stroke scare that proved to be an ear infection, and a near-fatal case of COVID, this was the one battle he could not overcome. But the strangest part wasn't his death. It is everything he lied about for decades to make people believe he never could, starting with the very story that made him famous in the first place. A hospital room. Nobody explained. David Allan Coe spent his final days tucked away inside an intensive care unit, and by the time his wife Kimberly confirmed his death publicly to reporters, most of the actual medical specifics were already gone from the record entirely. No named illness, no public statement about what had actually put him there. Just an 86-year-old man, gone, with a career that stretched back over 5 decades and a body that had been treated like a stunt double for years. Tributes poured in almost immediately. Willie Nelson, Kid Rock, Hank Williams Jr., and Hank Williams III, Chris Stapleton, Eric Church, Tanya Tucker, whose own career had been launched in part by one of his songs, all of them mourning a man whose entire public image had been built, piece by careful piece over 5 decades, on stories that were not always entirely true. And the biggest one of those stories almost nobody has actually verified until recently, a story so central to who people thought he was that even his own family kept repeating it long after it should have fallen apart. A song about living forever. In 2024, roughly 2 years before that final hospital room in Daytona Beach, Coe teamed up with Hank Williams III and the newer country artist Hardy on a song deliberately called Live Forever. It was meant as a wink, a nod to his own reputation as a man who simply refused to die. By that point, he had already survived a serious car accident, a health scare that hospitals initially mistook for a stroke, a knee replacement in his 80s, and a case of COVID so severe he had to be fed through a tube. Every single time he came back, he toured, he performed. The joke practically wrote itself, right up until it stopped being funny. Nobody involved in that song could have known it would end up sounding less like bravado and more like foreshadowing within 2 years. But before any of that irony makes sense, you have to understand the story he told about himself long before any of it was true. A story so dramatic that for decades it overshadowed almost everything he actually did to become famous. For decades, David Allan Coe told a story about his own past that made him sound less like a working musician and more like a violent, larger-than-life myth built specifically to intimidate. He said he had once served time on death row, sentenced to die for killing a fellow inmate who had violently attacked him behind bars. It was a brutal story, and it became part of his entire public identity as an outlaw who had lived a harder life than any of his peers. Reporters repeated it. Fans repeated it. For years, it was simply accepted as part of who David Allan Coe was. There was just one problem. It was not true. A documentarian researching his past eventually tracked down the actual prison records. No death row sentence existed, no killing. The real charges on his record were for things like possessing burglary tools and indecent materials. Serious enough on their own, but nowhere near the version he had been telling audiences for years. Coe never fully backed down from the story, even after it was debunked. He kept insisting the outlaw movement itself owed something to a wild, chaotic gathering he had once been part of in Oklahoma. Whatever the truth was, the fabricated version had already done its job. It made him unforgettable. However, this brings something else into focus. If he could invent something that brutal and get away with it for decades without serious consequence, what did the actual, unassuming truth of his early life look like underneath it? Reform school before he was 10. Take away the invented death row story entirely. Strip away every exaggerated detail he ever added for effect, and what is actually left underneath still turns out to be genuinely rough on its own. Coe was sent to a reform school at 9 years old, an age at which most kids are worried about homework, not incarceration. From there, he spent a large chunk of his childhood and young adulthood cycling in and out of correctional facilities across Ohio, eventually landing in the Ohio State Penitentiary as a young man on charges connected to auto theft and armed robbery, spending years there before ever building any kind of life outside prison walls. Inside, he taught himself guitar and started writing songs, encouraged by other inmates who were also chasing something bigger than the walls around them, including a fellow prisoner known for his own singing, who pushed Coe to keep at it. He was not released for good until 1967, meaning he spent the better part of 2 decades moving in and out of institutions before he ever set foot in Nashville as a free man with a guitar and nothing else. What happened the moment he actually arrived in that city is almost as unlikely as anything in the fake version of his story. A hearse parked outside the Ryman. When Coe finally made it to Nashville in the late 1960s, fresh out of the prison system with almost nothing to his name, he had no money, no connections, and no plan beyond singing on street corners for whatever change passers-by were willing to give him. For a while, he lived out of a hearse parked outside the Ryman Auditorium, the most famous stage in country music, close enough to see it every single day, and still be locked completely outside of it. Producer Shelby Singleton eventually noticed him busking and signed him to Plantation Records, leading to his 1970 debut album, Penitentiary Blues, drawn directly from what he had lived through behind bars. It did not make him famous overnight. What it did was put him on the radar of people who mattered, including steel guitarist Pete Drake, who ran a Nashville publishing company and signed Coe to an exclusive songwriting deal in October of 1971, well before Coe had any real solo success of his own as a performer. That single connection would end up defining his entire image for the next several years, in a way that had almost nothing to do with his actual music. A mask borrowed from a cowboy. By the mid-1970s, Coe had built a stage persona nobody else in country music was attempting at the time, one built entirely on mystery, provocation, and a look that made him instantly recognizable from across an entire arena. Rhinestone suits, a Lone Ranger-style mask. He got the rhinestones from fellow performer Mel Tillis, who handed over an entire closet of the outfits after Coe admired them. The mask came from a conversation with his father, who told him the only way the Lone Ranger could walk through town unnoticed was by wearing one, and that once he took it off, David Allan Coe could disappear the same way, free from being recognized everywhere he went. That reasoning became the backbone of his identity for years. He released The Mysterious Rhinestone Cowboy in 1974, then Long-Haired Redneck in 1976, aligning himself with the emerging outlaw country movement alongside Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, 2 men who had already spent years pushing back against the polished Nashville sound before Coe ever showed up, and who would go on to become far more commercially successful than he ever was, despite Coe's constant insistence that he belonged right alongside them. That gap between how famous he claimed to be and how much money he was actually making would end up defining the rest of his career. Hits that made other men rich. Here is the part of Coe's career that gets conveniently left out of most of the mythology surrounding him, the part that complicates the simple outlaw story people prefer to tell. Some of his biggest successes were not really his, at least not commercially. He wrote Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone, and it became a #1 hit for Tanya Tucker in 1973. Not for him. He wrote Take This Job and Shove It, and it became a massive #1 hit for Johnny Paycheck in 1977, inspiring an entire movie with the same title, while Coe's own version stayed comparatively obscure. His own performing career did produce real hits, You Never Even Call Me By My Name, reaching the country top 10 and becoming one of the most quoted novelty songs in the genre's history. The Ride, becoming one of his signature songs in 1983 with its story about picking up the ghost of Hank Williams Sr. on a highway. Mona Lisa lost her smile climbing to #2 the following year. But the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath his entire career is that David Allan Coe made other artists rich with songs he wrote, while his own bank account told a very different story for most of his life, one that would eventually catch up with him in a much more permanent way than a bad royalty check. Coe's reputation as an outlaw was never just about prison records and rhinestone suits, and this is the part of his story that critics inside the music industry brought up again and again for decades afterward. His 1986 album, Son of the South, featured him on the cover holding a newborn baby with a Confederate flag draped over his shoulder, and the backlash inside the music industry was immediate. Around the same period, he released 2 albums frequently labeled X-rated, containing material that critics and fellow musicians described as racist, homophobic, and degrading toward women. Material he sold largely through mail order rather than mainstream retail, specifically because of how extreme it was. A widely read New York Times piece called his music openly bigoted, and the criticism followed him for the rest of his career. Coe's own defense never really changed. He argued the material was creative expression, rooted in his own experience inside prison, where he said he had built friendships across racial lines that people judging his lyrics from the outside knew nothing about. Critics were rarely convinced, and the debate over whether his most extreme material was daring honesty or something far uglier never really got settled, even by the time he died. That same stubborn refusal to soften anything about himself would show up again years later in a completely different arena, one involving the federal government instead of music critics. Surviving everything except this. For over a decade before his actual death, Coe kept ending up in hospitals across the country for one serious medical event after another, and every single time, almost without exception, he walked back out again. In 2013, a car crash in Florida left him with broken ribs, bruised kidneys, and head trauma serious enough to require hospitalization for over a week. And he was back on stage within weeks of being discharged, as though nothing had happened at all. In 2018, a hospitalization initially reported as a stroke turned out to be a serious ear infection instead, resolved within 2 days. In 2019, he underwent knee replacement surgery in his late 70s and was released from the hospital almost immediately. Then, in 2021, at 82 years old, Coe caught COVID so severely he needed supplemental oxygen and intravenous feeding for weeks, a hospitalization serious enough that fans openly worried it would be the one that finally ended things. He recovered again, went home, and started planning his return to the stage. Each recovery only reinforced the myth he had spent his whole life cultivating, that David Allan Coe simply could not be killed by ordinary means. Meanwhile, a completely different kind of trouble had already been quietly building for years, one that had nothing to do with hospitals at all. While his health kept testing him again and again through his final decades, his finances were quietly falling apart in the background, largely out of public view, until the paperwork eventually became impossible to hide. In 2003, Coe filed for bankruptcy and, in the process, sold off ownership of every song he had written before 1984 for a reported $25,000, a fraction of what that catalog was actually worth, given how many of those songs had already become hits for other artists. He later claimed he had not even understood the terms of the deal until well after signing it, partly because flooding had destroyed the financial records he needed to properly evaluate his own situation, leaving him unable to prove ownership of assets he had spent decades building. The IRS trouble followed him even further. In 2015, Coe pleaded guilty to impeding and obstructing federal tax law, was sentenced to 3 years of probation, and ordered to repay close to $1 million in back taxes. For a man who had built his entire persona around defying authority, the ending of that particular fight looked less like rebellion and more like an old man finally out of leverage. It would not be the last time his carefully built image ran directly into a much plainer, much less flattering reality. A metal record nobody expected. Somewhere in the middle of all the controversy and financial chaos that defined so much of his career, Coe kept finding strange new corners of music to explore, ones that had almost nothing to do with the outlaw country reputation everyone already expected from him. Starting in 1999, he began recording with Dimebag Darrell, the guitarist from the heavy metal band Pantera, on an album that blended country storytelling with metal instrumentation under the working title Rebel Meets Rebel. They recorded in scattered sessions over several years, but the album did not actually come out until 2006, 2 years after Darrell was killed on stage during a separate performance. Coe also contributed songwriting to Kid Rock's self-titled album in 2003, including a track called Single Father that helped give his career one more unexpected boost decades after his own biggest hits had already happened, and long after most people assumed his relevance had faded entirely. His personal life moved through just as much turbulence as his career did, arguably more so given how many times he started over. He married 6 times over the course of his life, and by most accounts, keeping his relationships stable proved just as difficult as keeping his finances in order, though his final marriage to Kimberly Hastings in 2010 lasted until the very end. None of that instability ever seemed to slow down the music itself, right up until the year everything finally did stop. Live forever, dead at 86. By the 2020s, Coe was still performing, still touring, still leaning into the outlaw image that had defined him since the 70s, even collaborating with acts like the Moonshine Bandits in 2017 on a song called Baptized in Bourbon, proof that he had never fully stepped away from the spotlight even as he aged into his 80s. His 2024 collaboration with Hank Williams III and Hardy on Live Forever felt at the time like one more joke from a man who had turned outliving expectations into a personal brand, a punchline built on top of 2 decades of hospital visits he had somehow walked away from every single time. Then, in April of 2026, he was admitted to a hospital in Daytona Beach and moved into intensive care. He died there on the 29th at 5 in the evening, according to his representative. Later reporting listed pneumonia as a contributing factor, though his family never issued a detailed public account of his final illness, continuing a pattern of privacy around his health that had defined his final years. Willie Nelson, Kid Rock, both Hank Williams's, Chris Stapleton, Eric Church, Sturgill Simpson, Jamie Johnson, and dozens of other artists released tributes within hours, each one describing a man who had shaped outlaw country, whether the industry wanted to admit it or not. The man who spent decades insisting he had once escaped death itself in a prison cell finally ran out of escapes in a hospital bed, still married to Kimberly Hastings, the woman who had stood beside him since 2010, and still surrounded by a mythology he had spent his whole life writing about himself. True parts and invented parts tangled together so tightly that even now, nobody agrees on where one ends and the other begins. Knowing how much of his own life story David Allan Coe made up over the decades, which part of his legend do you think actually mattered more to him in the end? The truth or the myth he spent a lifetime building on top of it? Share with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this unveil, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.